They looked at her and laughed. A fat, sickly woman, trembling even just standing upright, who would believe she could survive a winter in the wilderness? The rancher was disappointed. The cowboys turned away to hide their smiles. Her little daughter clung to her mother's hand with nowhere else to go. But that night, the night the blizzard devoured the prairie, that very woman rose up and did what no one dared believe was possible. Please like, comment the city you're viewing from so I know how far this story has come. And don't leave, because the best is yet to come. The wagon came in slow, the way things move when they're carrying more weight than they were built for. It rolled up the rutted track that wound through the scrub grass of Iron Mesa in the last gray light of a November afternoon, and the two ranch hands who happened to be near the gate, Denny Falk and a newer man named Craddock, stopped what they were doing to watch it come. They weren't watching out of welcome. They were watching the way men watch something they don't quite believe. "That her?" Craddock said. Denny squinted. "Must be." The driver, an old freight man named Obie, who picked up whatever paying jobs crossed his path, pulled the team to a halt near the main house and set the brake with his boot. He climbed down without hurry and went around to the back. He lowered the gate and held out his hand, and after a moment, a hand took it. She came down careful, 1 foot at a time, testing each step like the ground might not hold. When she reached the dirt, she stood still for a moment and just breathed. Her coat was dark wool, worn at the elbows, and it strained across her shoulders and back. Not because it was too small exactly, but because the body it covered was a substantial one. She was heavy in the way that speaks of years, not just meals. Her face was pale and damp despite the cold, and there were shadows under her eyes so deep they looked like bruises. She was maybe 30. She looked 50. Behind her, a little girl climbed out without waiting for help, quick and light as a sparrow, dark-haired, maybe 6 years old. The child landed in the dirt, grabbed her mother's hand immediately, and looked around at Iron Mesa Ranch with wide, measuring eyes. Colton Briggs came off the porch. He was a tall man, lean through the jaw and shoulders, with the kind of face that had spent too many years in wind to be considered handsome anymore. He wore no expression worth reading as he crossed the yard toward the wagon. He had hired a housekeeper through a letter arrangement, the kind that was common enough out here where women of any domestic skill were scarce. The letter had described a widow, experienced in cooking and household management, willing to relocate. He had pictured someone capable, someone with the build for hard work in a hard place. He stopped about 6 feet from her. She met his eyes. "Mr. Briggs." "Mrs. Mercer." A pause stretched between them like a rope pulled tight. He was looking at her the way a man looks when he's trying to find a polite word for his disappointment and can't locate one. "You had a long trip," he said finally. 3 days. She said it without complaint, just as a fact. "The last stretch was rough. You need to sit down." "I'll be fine." She didn't look fine. She looked like a woman who had survived the trip through sheer stubbornness and was now running on the fumes of it. There was a slight tremor in her free hand, the one not holding her daughter's. Colton noticed it. He noticed that she noticed him noticing, and he saw something move behind her eyes. Not shame, something harder than that. "This is Lily," she said, and looked down at the girl. The child looked up at Colton with an expression that could only be described as watchful. She didn't smile. She didn't hide behind her mother either. "Hello," Lily said. "Hello," Colton said. He looked back at Hazel Mercer, and she was already scanning the yard, the layout of the outbuildings, the condition of the main house, the distance between the cookhouse and the well. Even standing there, barely upright, she was taking inventory. "I was told the previous housekeeper left in October," she said. "That's right." "Who's been cooking?" "Rotation, whoever pulls the short stick." She nodded. "I'd like to see the kitchen." Colton opened his mouth, closed it again. What he wanted to say was that maybe she should rest first, sleep, maybe eat something. What he actually heard in his head was the voice of his foreman, Walsh, who that morning had said with characteristic bluntness, "She's not going to last 2 weeks, boss. I can smell it from here, and she hasn't even arrived yet." He hadn't argued with Walsh, which was its own kind of answer. "I'll have someone show you to your room," he said instead. "I'd rather see the kitchen." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped aside and gestured toward the house. The kitchen at Iron Mesa was a large room, which was its best quality. It had a wood range that was older than it should have been, a wide pine table scarred by years of use, shelves that needed reorganizing, and a window that looked out on the back of the property where the land fell away toward a dry creek bed. It smelled like old grease and wood smoke. Hazel stood in the center of it and turned slowly, taking it in. Lily stood near the door, still watching. Craddock had followed them in, curious, and now leaned in the doorframe with his arms crossed. "Range works?" Hazel asked. "When it wants to," Colton said. She walked to it, opened the firebox, looked inside, checked the damper, ran her fingers along the edge of the cast iron surface the way a musician might test piano keys they're not sure are in tune. "The flue draws clean?" "Mostly." She went to the shelves, scanned the dry goods, flour, cornmeal, salt, dried beans, some tins she'd have to open to know. She opened a tin and sniffed it, replaced the lid. "You have lard?" "Root cellar." "Potatoes?" "Some." "Onions?" "Yes." She turned around and looked at him. "I can make supper tonight." Colton hesitated. Behind him, he heard Craddock make a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more like the breath before one. "Mrs. Mercer," Colton said carefully, "you've just arrived after 3 days of travel. You look tired," she said. "I know how I look. I'm asking if I can cook supper. You don't need to prove anything tonight." "I'm not proving anything," she said. "I'm asking to do my job." A small pause. "Or would you rather someone pulls the short stick again?" Craddock did laugh this time. Just a short one. Colton shot him a look. "The men eat at 6, Colton said. "I'll have something ready." He studied her face. Whatever he was looking for, he either found it or gave up looking. "All right," he said. "Obi will bring your bags in. Your room is off the back hall, the second door." He left. Craddock lingered a moment longer, still with that expression, the one that said he'd be back at 6 to see how this went, and that he expected to be entertained. When they were alone, Lily came to stand beside her mother. She took Hazel's hand again and didn't say anything, and Hazel squeezed her fingers once before letting go. "Sit at the table," Hazel told her. "I need to start a fire." She had been sick since March. That was the part no one here knew, and she had no intention of telling them. The sickness had started as a deep fatigue that she'd first tried to explain away. She was grieving, after all. Marcus had died in January, taken by a fever that moved through their town like fire through dry grass. Grief was supposed to be exhausting, but by spring the exhaustion had deepened into something structural, something that lived in her bones, and her body had started to bloat and swell in ways that frightened her. The doctor in their town, a small damp place in eastern Kansas called Holt, had told her she had a heart condition affecting how her blood moved through her body. He'd said it in that doctor's way that tells you the news without wanting to be responsible for it. He'd told her to rest. She couldn't rest. She had Lily. She had almost nothing left after the medical bills and the burial costs and the debts Marcus had left behind that she hadn't known about until she was opening condolence mail and found collection notices tucked between the sympathy cards. She had the furniture in a house she could no longer afford, a daughter who needed feeding, and a body that had started betraying her in ways she could not afford to acknowledge. So she had answered the advertisement. Wanted. Experienced housekeeper and cook for working cattle ranch, Iron Mesa, New Mexico territory. Widow preferred. Room and board provided. References required. She'd written a letter. She'd gotten a reply. She'd packed what fit in 2 bags and taken her daughter west. She had not lied in the letter. Exactly. She had described her experience accurately. The years cooking for harvest crews in Kansas, the summer she'd spent feeding 40 railroad workers in the Colorado high country when she was 19, the decade of keeping a household that ran on tight margins and tighter schedules. All of it true. She had not mentioned the heart condition. She had not mentioned the swollen legs. She had not mentioned that some mornings she had to sit on the edge of the bed for 20 minutes before she could trust herself to stand. She knew, in the part of herself that was honest before dawn, that this had been its own kind of lie. But she also knew that if she had told the truth, the letter back would have been a polite rejection, and she and Lily would have been sitting on a train platform somewhere with 2 bags and no destination. Survival, she had found, required a certain selective presentation of facts. Dumps. She made pinto beans with salt pork cornbread and fried potatoes with onion. Simple food, but she made it well. The beans had depth, The cornbread had a crust that cracked right. The potatoes were salted at the correct moment so they crisped instead of steamed. She kept her feet moving because if she stopped for long, the pain would settle in and stiffen, and she couldn't afford to seize up in front of strangers. At 6 o'clock, 8 men filed in from the yard. They were all different shapes and ages. A bow-legged old man called Tate, a pair of Mexican brothers named Ruiz who worked the south pastures, a young red-headed boy they called Sparky, who couldn't have been more than 17, and others whose names she didn't learn that first night. Walsh, the foreman, came in last. He was a solid block of a man with a gray mustache and the look of someone who had been skeptical about everything for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to be otherwise. They came in expecting what? She could see it in the way they looked at the food first, then at her, then at each other. Some checking reaction. Maybe they'd expected something barely edible. Maybe they'd expected nothing at all. Walsh sat down, served himself, and ate without comment for a while. Then, "Beans are good." It wasn't a compliment so much as a declaration of mild surprise. But from Walsh, she gathered it was approximately the same thing. Craddock, across the table, was eating the cornbread with an expression that suggested he hadn't intended to be this invested in it. "You make this yourself?" he asked, meaning the bread. "Yes." "Tonight? Just now?" "Yes." He looked at the piece in his hand like he was reassessing something. Then he took another bite and didn't say anything else. Colton ate at the end of the table. He didn't say anything, but once, toward the end of the meal, he looked up and met her eyes across the length of the room. She held his gaze. His expression hadn't changed. It rarely seemed to. But something in it had shifted slightly, the way a door shifts when someone on the other side lets go of the handle. When the men had finished and pushed back from the table, Hazel began clearing. Walsh stopped by the door. "You need help with the wash-up?" he said. His voice was flat, not kind exactly, but not unkind. "No," she said. He looked at her a moment longer, nodded once, and left. She stood at the wash basin afterwards, scrubbing the pot, and her legs were 2 columns of hot ache below her. Lily had fallen asleep at the small table in the corner, her head on her folded arms. The kitchen smelled of food and wood smoke, and it was warm, and Hazel leaned her forearms on the rim of the basin and just stood there for a moment, not moving. She'd made it through the first evening. That was all she'd given herself permission to think about. The first week was a study in pain management, not the dramatic kind, not collapsing, not crying, not scenes, just the constant quiet renegotiation between what her body would give and what the job required. She was up at 5 every morning because the breakfast fire had to be lit and the dough for biscuits set if there were to be biscuits. And there had to be biscuits. Because without something starchy and filling, the men came to the table irritable and stayed that way. She kept track of which chores she could do sitting down versus which required standing, and arranged her morning so that the standing ones were done first, before her legs stiffened, and the sitting ones, peeling, sorting, shelling, came in the middle of the day when her body most wanted to stop. She had a particular technique she'd developed in the months since March. She'd brace one hand on whatever surface was nearby. The counter, the wall, the table edge. Not leaning her full weight on it, just resting it there. An anchor. It helped her stay upright longer and distributed the strain in a way her body could tolerate. The men noticed. Of course they noticed. Men who work outside all day in close proximity notice everything. They just vary in whether they say anything. Craddock said something to Denny, who said something to the Ruiz brothers, and by midweek there was a general low-level awareness among the crew that the new housekeeper was not well, and was either going to last 3 weeks or 3 months, and no one was sure which. Walsh had said nothing to Colton directly, but Colton heard things secondhand the way a man always hears things about his own property, at an angle, incomplete but persistent. On Thursday of her first week, she dropped an iron skillet. She was moving it from the range to the shelf and her grip gave out. Not from carelessness, but from a simple failure of hand strength, the kind that came without warning these days. And the skillet hit the kitchen floor with a sound like a rifle shot. Lily, who was drawing at the table, jumped. Hazel stood and looked at the skillet on the floor for a long, still moment. Then she bent down and picked it up. She felt the blood in her face and the burning in her legs as she straightened. She set the skillet on the shelf. She went back to what she had been doing. Sparky appeared in the kitchen doorway 30 seconds later, drawn by the noise. He looked at her, then at the skillet on the shelf, then back at her. "Everything okay?" "Fine," she said. "Thank you." He hovered a moment longer, the way young men do when they want to help but don't know how to offer it without implying that help is needed. If you need anything moved or like heavy pots or anything." "I appreciate that," she said. "I'll let you know." He left and she went back to work, and that was that. But later she heard him, through the thin wall between the kitchen and the yard, say to someone, "She dropped that pan and she just picked it right back up. Didn't even stop." And the someone, whoever it was, didn't say anything in reply. Colton found her on Friday evening sitting on the back step. She was just sitting there in the cold, not wearing her coat, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. The sky to the north had gone the color of old pewter, and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees since noon. He stood in the doorway. "You should be inside." "I know." She didn't move. He came and sat on the step beside her, which was not something he'd planned to do, but the step was there, and so was she, and it seemed rude to loom. He looked north at the sky. "Storm coming," he said. "How bad?" "Hard to say yet. Could be a lot of snow. The boys who went with the cattle drive were supposed to be back by Wednesday." He paused. "They're late." She looked at the sky, too. "How many?" 16, with the trail cook." She was quiet for a moment. "Your cook went with them?" "Reuben does both. He goes out on the drives, comes back." He paused. "Usually." She looked at him then, and he looked at her, and the thing that passed between them wasn't exactly spoken. "The storm," she started, "might come in fast. Might already have those boys caught between here and the canyon." She drank her coffee, looked back at the sky. "I'll need to know what's in the root cellar," she said. "Everything. Every potato, every sack of flour, every piece of salt meat. I need a full count." He studied her profile. "Mrs. Mercer, if that storm comes in the way I think it might, then you'll need to feed 16 frozen men whenever they get here," she said, "and I need to know what I'm working with." He didn't argue. He said, "I'll have Sparky take you down in the morning." She nodded, finished her coffee. "You should get your coat," he said. "I was about to." She wasn't, but she stood and went inside, and Colton sat on the step alone for a while, looking at the northern sky, thinking about a woman who was quite obviously not well, and was quite obviously not going to admit it, and was quite obviously not going to stop. He didn't know what to do with that. He wasn't sure anything needed to be done. By Saturday noon, the temperature had dropped to the kind of number that made the air feel dangerous, and the sky in the north had gone from pewter to something closer to green-gray, which was the color that meant business. Walsh came in from checking the south pastures and stomped his boots on the porch and said to no one in particular, "It's coming." Hazel was in the root cellar by then, which was dug into the hillside behind the main house, a low, cool space smelling of earth and old vegetables. Sparky held the lantern while she went through everything. She moved slowly in the confined space, but she was thorough. She counted 6 20-pound sacks of flour, 3 of cornmeal, a partial sack of sugar, a crate of potatoes that had seen better days, 4 slabs of salt pork wrapped in cloth, dried beans in 2 large barrels, canned goods, tomatoes, corn, some unlabeled tins, and a small quantity of lard that she judged sufficient if nothing went wrong. She made notes on a scrap of paper with a pencil stub. "Is there anything else?" she asked Sparky. "Might be some stuff in the storage shed. I'd have to look." "Look," she said. "I need to know." He came back with a report of more dried onions, a crock of molasses, and a small sack of dried apple rings that had been forgotten there since last spring. She stood in the cold outside the root cellar and did the arithmetic in her head. 16 men coming in from a cattle drive, frozen, depleted, hungry in that bone-deep way that comes from hard riding and bad cold. The hands already on the ranch, 8 including Walsh. Food stores adequate for the next month of regular meals, stretched thinner for a sudden influx of 16. Workable, if she was strategic about it. "What time do the cattle boys usually come in?" she asked. Depends. If the weather pushes them hard, they might ride through the night. So they could be here by dawn. Could be. She folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket. She stood for a moment in the cold, not moving, feeling the ache in her legs and the heaviness in her chest that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with fluid and strain. She thought about the men out in that darkening sky. 16 of them, coming home to whatever was waiting. "Tell Mr. Briggs I'll start on bread tonight," she said. "I'll need the stove going hot by 8 and someone to keep the woodbox filled through the night." Sparky looked at her. "Through the whole night?" "Yes. Are you—" He stopped himself. "Go tell him," she said. He went. She stood outside a moment longer, her breath making short white clouds in the air, her hands already calculating what went in what order and how long each thing took and how she could arrange the work so that the most critical things were done before she was too tired to do them well. Then she went inside and started. Colton came to the kitchen at 8:30 and found it already transformed. The stove was going hard, throwing heat into the room in a way that made the outside cold feel impossible. There were 2 large Dutch ovens on the range, both covered, both smelling of something that had been building for a while. He could pick out onion and meat and something deeper underneath. 2 rounds of bread dough were set near the stove in greased bowls, covered with cloth, rising in the warmth. She had the big soup kettle he hadn't seen used in 2 years out, and scrubbed and sitting ready. Hazel was at the table working butter into a fresh batch of biscuit dough. Her sleeves were pushed up, her hair, usually pinned, had come half loose. There was flour on her left arm and a line of concentration between her eyes. She looked up when he came in. "The bread won't be ready until 11, she said. "First loaves." "You don't need to, How many riders?" she said. "Can you estimate?" He looked at her. 16, I said. "Plus you're 8, plus you and Walsh." She turned the dough. 27 at minimum. "You can't cook for 27 men through the night by yourself." She paused in her work, looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking for your permission," she said. "I'm asking if there's anything else I should know. Any food allergies. Any man who needs something different. Anyone who'll be injured and needs something soft." He stood there. "Dalton broke a tooth on the drive," he said after a moment. "He's been having trouble with hard things. I'll make a corn porridge separate for him. Anything else?" "No." "Then let me work." He stood in the kitchen for another few seconds, long enough that she glanced up again, and then he did something she didn't expect. He went to the woodbox, checked it, picked up his coat from the peg, and went out. 20 minutes later, he came back with an armful of split wood and loaded the box without being asked. He did it a second time an hour later. He didn't say anything about it, and neither did she. But somewhere in that exchange, a thing was settled between them that hadn't been there before. Lily slept on the bench against the wall, wrapped in her coat, undisturbed by the heat and the smell and the quiet rhythmic sounds of her mother working. The wind picked up outside around 10 o'clock. By midnight, it was howling. Hazel baked the first round of bread and pulled it golden from the oven and set it on the rack and started the second. She stirred the stew, adjusted the seasoning, added the rest of the beans to the kettle with the bone broth she'd started from the ham hocks she'd found at the back of the cold storage. She made a pot of coffee because she needed it, and because if the riders came in frozen, they'd need something hot and immediate before they could even think about food. By 2 in the morning, her legs had moved past pain into something that was almost numbness, which she knew from experience was worse in the long run, but useful in the short one. She braced herself against the counter between tasks. She sat on the stool for 10 minutes at a time when she could, doing the tasks that allowed for it. Cutting, sorting, measuring. At some point she realized Walsh was in the doorway. He'd been there a while, she thought, just standing there in the dark of the back hall, watching her work. "You should sleep," he said. "When they're fed," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he came in and sat at the table, and without a word he took the second batch of biscuit dough she'd set there and began cutting it. He wasn't a man who'd done much baking, that was clear from the way he handled it. Too rough, not enough care. But she talked him through it in a few words, and he listened and adjusted. And they worked in silence for a time, with only the wind screaming outside and the stove crackling between them. At one point he looked at her and said, "You've cooked for crowds before." "Yes," she said. "Railroad crews," he said. It wasn't a question. "Or something like that." She looked at him. Something like that. He nodded and went back to the biscuits. She didn't ask him how he knew. She was too tired and there was too much left to do, and the first thin light of dawn was still a long way off, and somewhere out in the dark and the howling wind, 16 men were riding toward this kitchen and this fire and this food, and she was not going to stop until it was ready. She kept moving. The first rider came in at 20 minutes past 4 in the morning. Hazel heard the horse before she saw anything. Hoofbeats muffled by wind and snow, then the sound of the barn door, then voices. She was at the stove when Colton came through the back door with snow on his shoulders, and his jaw set in that particular way that meant things were worse than expected. "They're coming in," he said. "First 3 just hit the yard, the rest are strung out behind them. Maybe another hour before the tail end makes it." "How bad?" He pulled off his gloves and held his hands near the stove. "Bad enough? 2 horses went lame in the canyon, men doubled up. Reuben's hands are bad, frostbite on the fingers. Maybe worse. He's going straight to the bunkhouse." She absorbed this. "So no trail cook." "No trail cook." She turned back to the range. The stew in the big kettle had been simmering for 3 hours and was exactly where she needed it. The bread, 4 loaves, 2 rounds of cornbread, sat cooling on the rack. The biscuits Walsh had helped cut were in the oven now, second batch, and the smell of them had started filling the hall beyond the kitchen. The coffee pot was enormous, borrowed from the cookhouse, and it had been going since midnight. "Tell them to come to the kitchen when they're ready," she said. "Not the bunkhouse. Here." Colton looked at her back. "All of them?" "All of them." He hesitated at the door. "Hazel." It was the first time he'd used her name without the title attached, and it came out awkward, like something he hadn't meant to say exactly that way. "You've been on your feet for, 9 hours?" "Tell them to come to the kitchen," she said again, and the steadiness in her voice settled the matter. He went. Walsh was still at the table. He'd fallen asleep sitting up sometime around 2 with his arms crossed and his chin on his chest, and she'd left him that way rather than wake him. He stirred now at the sound of voices in the yard, lifted his head, blinked, looked at the kitchen, at the bread, the stew, the full coffee pot, and then at her, and said nothing. He got up, went to the door, looked out into the dark. "First ones are in," he said. "I know." He turned. "You need me to do anything?" "Bowls," she said. "The shelf by the window. Stack them on the table. And get the cups down. All of them, even the chipped ones." He moved. They came in by 1s and 2s over the next 40 minutes, and each one looked worse than the last. These were not men who frightened easily. They were cattlemen, trail riders, men who'd spent weeks on horseback in country that didn't forgive mistakes. But cold did something to a person that other hardships didn't. It stripped away the surface performance of toughness and left something raw underneath. They came through this kitchen door with ice in their beards and their faces the color of old ash, and they stood in the sudden warmth, and some of them just stopped and breathed for a moment, like they'd forgotten warmth was a thing that existed. The first man in, a lean rider named Cord, who was one of the senior drovers, came through the door and stopped dead when he saw the table. He stared at the bread, the stew, the coffee. He looked at Hazel, who was ladling stew into the first bowl. "Who?" he started. "Sit down," she said. "Eat." He sat. The next 2 came in right behind him, and then 3 more, and the kitchen filled fast. The room was not really big enough for this many people, and it got loud. The scrape of chairs, the clink of cups, men's voices, low and rough with exhaustion, asking each other things like, "How are your hands?" and "Did you see what happened to Petey's horse at the canyon?" They ate with a focused urgency that was almost animal, the way people eat when they've been told by their bodies that the eating is necessary and not optional. Sparky came in near the back of the group and stopped when he saw the spread. He was 17 and had not yet learned to hide what was on his face. And what was on his face right now was something close to disbelief. "She did all this?" he said to no one in particular. "Shut up and eat," Walsh told him, not unkindly. Hazel kept moving. Bowl to table, coffee poured, bread sliced. Her left hand was braced on the counter between each trip, and her right was carrying, and the pain in her legs had come back from the brief numbness of the early morning hours into something more pointed and specific. There was a particular spot on her right ankle, just above the joint, that had been swollen for 2 weeks, and was now announcing itself with every step like a nail being slowly driven in. She didn't stop. Denny Falk, one of the ranch hands who'd watched her arrival with that sideways skepticism, came to refill his coffee cup himself rather than wait, and found himself standing beside her at the stove. He was a man of about 40, with a habit of keeping his opinions in his jaw rather than saying them aloud, and he stood there a moment filling his cup. "Good stew," he said. "Thank you." "Real good." She glanced at him. He looked embarrassed, the way men look when they've said something sincere by accident. "There's more in the kettle," she said. "Help yourself." He nodded and went back to the table. And that was the end of that conversation, but she noticed that when two of the trailmen started a complaint about the sleeping arrangements in the bunkhouse, Denny told them to keep it down because the woman had been cooking all night and didn't need to hear their noise. Small things. But she noticed them. Bapashem. The last rider came in just before 6. He was an old man, or he moved like one. He came through the door bent forward, his coat so crusted with snow and ice that it looked like something dredged from a riverbed, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, not speaking, until one of the other trailmen stood and helped him to a chair. His name, she learned, was Amos Tidd. He was somewhere in his 60s, with a face like a walnut left in the sun, and he'd spent 40 years riding cattle routes all over the Southwest. He was the kind of man who'd become a legend without ever intending to be one. Not for heroism exactly, but for the accumulated weight of having been present at many things. He sat in the chair they put him in and let someone pull off his outer coat, and he looked around the kitchen with sunken, exhausted eyes. Then those eyes found Hazel. He watched her for a long moment. She was at the stove, back to him, working. She didn't notice him watching. Cord, sitting beside him, leaned over and said something quietly. Amos didn't respond immediately. He kept watching. Then, slowly, he said, "What's her name?" "The housekeeper?" "Mercer." "Hazel Mercer." Another silence. "Where'd she come from?" "Kansas, I heard." Amos Tidd looked at the bread on the table. He looked at the cornbread. He looked at the stew in his bowl, at the particular color of it and the way the fat sat on top, and the smell that was coming off it. The specific combination of things that a person with decades of eating camp food learns to read the way other people read faces. He didn't say anything more right then, but he kept watching. And by 7 in the morning, the kitchen was emptying. The men went to the bunkhouse to sleep, or to check on horses and equipment, or simply to stand outside in the cold and verify that they'd made it. The storm was still going, the wind hadn't let up, and the snow was coming down in sheets that made the barn, 50 yards from the house, almost invisible. But the immediate crisis of arrival was over. Everyone was in. Everyone was fed. Hazel washed the first round of bowls. She was at the basin, working through the stack, when she felt it. The particular dropping sensation in her chest that she'd come to associate with doing too much for too long. Not pain exactly. More like a warning. Like something inside her that had been wound too tight was beginning to release, and she needed to be sitting down before it finished releasing. She set down the bowl she was holding, put both hands flat on the rim of the basin. Lily was awake now, sitting at the corner table with a biscuit and a cup of warm water, watching her mother with those large, careful eyes. The child had learned. She was 6 years old, and she had learned what it meant when her mother stood very still like that. "Mama," Lily said quietly. "I'm fine, sweetheart." "You should sit." "In a minute." She stood at the basin until the sensation passed, which it did, eventually. It always did so far. She breathed through it and kept her hands on the rim and counted the seconds the way the doctor in Holt had told her to. If it lasts more than 2 minutes, sit down immediately. If it doesn't ease, lie flat. It eased at about 45 seconds. She picked up the bowl again. She didn't see Colton in the doorway until she turned to stack the clean dishes. He was there, leaning in the frame, and from the angle of him, she thought he'd been there for a little while. "Sit down," he said. "I'm almost done." "Hazel." She looked at him. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were doing something she hadn't seen from him before. Not anger, not the disappointment of her first day, but something more tangled than either of those. "I just need to finish the bowls," she said. "Leave them. They'll crust." "Then they'll crust." He came into the kitchen, took the bowl from her hand, gently, carefully, as if she was something breakable, which irritated her, and set it on the counter. "Sit down." She sat. She hated that it was a relief. He pulled the other chair to where she could put her feet up on it, and she didn't argue with that either. She sat and put her feet up and looked at her own hands on the table, red from the hot water, a little unsteady if she held them still long enough to notice. Colton sat across from her. He poured 2 cups of coffee from what was left in the pot and put one in front of her. "How long has it been like this?" he said. "Like what?" He gave her a look. She drank her coffee. It was barely warm at this point, but it was something to do with her hands. "Since spring," she said, because she was too tired to manage a better deflection. "What did the doctor say?" He said to rest. "And you decided to come cook for a cattle ranch." "I decided to not starve," she said, more sharply than she'd intended. She looked at him. "I have a daughter. I had no money. I had an offer." She paused. "I'm capable of the work. Tonight proved that. Tonight proved you can cook through injury and fatigue for 9 hours without stopping, which is a different thing. It's the same thing." "It's not." They looked at each other across the table. Lily had finished her biscuit and was watching both of them with the particular attention of a child who understands the shape of a conversation even when she can't parse all the words. "I'm not going to send you away," Colton said. "If that's what you're worried about." She said nothing. "I'm saying, take today. Sleep. The men can fend for themselves for 1 meal. There's 27 people on this ranch right now." "Hazel." "I'll sleep this afternoon," she said, "after the midday meal." He looked at her for a long time, then he picked up his coffee and said, "I'll peel the potatoes." She blinked. "What?" "For the midday meal. I'll peel the potatoes. I know how to peel a potato." She stared at him. "You're the owner of this ranch." "I'm aware of that." "You can't peel." "I can do whatever I decide to do on my own property," he said. His voice was even. "Where do you keep them?" A short silence. "Root cellar," she said. "Sparky knows where." He nodded and got up. At the door he stopped. 2 hours, he said. "Midday meal. You said it yourself. You'll sleep after." He left before she could argue further. She sat at the table for a moment, holding her cup. Lily came and climbed into the chair beside her without being asked, and pressed herself against her mother's arm, and Hazel leaned her cheek on top of her daughter's head and closed her eyes for 30 seconds. Just 30. Then she got up and started planning the midday meal. What? The blizzard held for 3 more days. 3 days in which Iron Mesa Ranch became a sealed world. Just the buildings, the animals, and 27 people existing inside a white that reached from ground to sky. The trailmen couldn't leave. The ranch hands couldn't work the pastures. Everyone was either in the bunkhouse or in the main house or making careful, bundled trips between the two, and the whole operation contracted down to its basic necessities. Stay warm, stay fed, wait it out. Which meant Hazel was cooking. Not alone. This became clear on the second morning when the dynamic of the kitchen shifted in a way she hadn't expected. It started with Walsh. He appeared at 6:30 and, without comment, put on a spare apron he'd found somewhere and asked her what needed doing first. She told him, and he did it. Then Sparky appeared an hour later and stood uselessly near the door until she gave him a task. And he turned out to be passable at stirring without scorching if you checked on him frequently. By the second afternoon, there was a loose rotation. Never official, never announced, men drifting through the kitchen and picking up tasks with varying levels of skill and willingness. Nobody saying much about it, but everybody doing something. It was not a smooth operation. Denny burned a batch of cornbread because he was distracted by a conversation with one of the trailmen and forgot to check the oven. 2 of the Ruiz brothers got into a quiet argument about how much salt went into a bean pot, which ended with both of them salting it and the beans coming out too salty, which Hazel fixed by adding more water and a handful of dried apple rings that mellowed the whole thing in a way she hadn't predicted but turned out to work. Sparky knocked a bucket of water across the floor on the second morning and spent 20 minutes cleaning it up while looking miserable, and she told him it was fine and handed him something else to do and didn't mention it again. These were not graceful scenes. They were the scenes of people who weren't accustomed to this work trying to do it anyway, which meant things went wrong in small ways with regular frequency, and the kitchen stayed loud and a little chaotic and not especially clean, and the food that came out of it was uneven. Some meals very good, some merely adequate. One lunch on the third day that was aggressively mediocre in a way that she had to work to accept without comment. But nobody went hungry, nobody missed a meal. And the thing that Hazel noticed, quietly, privately, in the way she noticed most things, was that the men who were helping in the kitchen were different at meals than they'd been before. Not kinder exactly, not softer, just more present. Men who ate food they'd had a hand in making, even a small hand, ate it differently. Less like fuel, more like something that had cost them something to make. It was a small shift. She wasn't sure most of them were aware of it. She was aware of it. Bosh. On the evening of the second day, Amos Tidd came to the kitchen alone. Most of the men had eaten and gone. Lily was asleep in the back room. Hazel was doing the last wash-up, and the kitchen was quiet except for the wind outside and the stove settling. Amos came in and pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited, which she didn't mind. He set his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. His fingers were stiff. He had some joint trouble, she'd noticed, though his gads had escaped the frostbite that had gotten Reuben. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right." "Colorado," he said. "Summer of '03. You were maybe 19, 20 years old. There was a railroad survey crew, so 40-some men up in the high country. They hit a bad stretch. Supply wagons couldn't get through for near 3 weeks. He paused. There was a cook, young woman, big-framed, dark hair, Kansas bred. She kept those men fed for 22 days on next to nothing. Improvised the whole thing, rye bread from forage grain, stew from whatever the hunters brought in, kept the fire going in snow that came up to the door lintels. Hazel kept washing the bowl in her hand. Her back was to him. People talked about it after, he said. The men from that crew, I knew 3 of them. They talked about that cook for years. A silence. What was her name? I could never remember. Hazel set the bowl on the rack, picked up the next one. Mercer, she said. Her name was Mercer. A long quiet. Hazel Mercer, he said, as if confirming something he'd suspected since he walked through the kitchen door at 6 in the morning and smelled the bread. She turned around then, looked at him across the kitchen. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read exactly. Not pity, not admiration, something more complicated than either. The look of a man who has seen a great many things over 60 years and knows how to hold them. You were something then, he said. I was young and healthy and working with better supplies than I had here, she said. It wasn't a miracle. It was just work. The men didn't think it was just work. Men who are hungry and cold are easy to impress. Amos Tidd smiled. It changed his face considerably, made him look less like a walnut and more like someone who'd once found the world genuinely amusing. They said she never stopped moving, he said. Even when she was sick, even when she had a fever that last week. They said she cooked anyway because if she stopped, the men would panic and start making poor decisions. Hazel said nothing. You had a fever then, too, he said. It wasn't a question. She wiped her hands on her apron. It was a long time ago. Things like that don't change, he said. He looked at his stiff hands on the table. The thing a person is when the pressure's on, that's the real thing. Everything else is just what they do when it's easy. He pushed back from the table. This was good food tonight, the stew especially. Thank you. He stood slowly with the particular care of old joints in cold weather. At the door he paused. The men here, he said, they're starting to see it. See what? What you are. He said it simply, not like a compliment, just a fact. Takes some people longer than others. He left. Hazel stood in the kitchen for a moment after he was gone, looking at the door. Then she turned back to the wash basin and finished the dishes. On the morning of the third day, Craddock apologized. He came in early, before most of the others, and he stood near the stove in a way that suggested he'd been thinking about this for a while and had come to do it before he lost his nerve. He was holding his hat, which men did when they were trying to look sincere. About when you first got here, he said. Hazel was mixing biscuit dough. She didn't stop. What about it? I said something to Denny about, he stopped, about how you looked. I know. He looked at the floor. He was maybe 25 with that particular young man combination of real remorse and not quite knowing what to do with it. It wasn't right, he said. What I said. No, she agreed. He stood there. You could start the fire in the cookhouse, she said. We're going to need the extra space today. He looked up. Yeah? If you want to help. He put his hat back on. Yeah, I can do that. A pause. Do you know how to... is there a particular way? Sparky knows the cookhouse stove, she said. Ask him. He nodded and went. And that was how Craddock became one of the kitchen rotation's most reliable members. Not because he had any particular skill, but because he showed up every time without being asked and did whatever was needed without complaint, which turned out to be a rarer quality than skill in a pinch. Denny came in an hour later, saw the empty spot where Craddock usually lingered, and asked where he'd gone. Cookhouse, Hazel said. Denny nodded slowly. He poured himself a coffee, stood at the window and looked at the white nothing outside for a moment. I laughed, he said. First day you arrived. I didn't say anything out loud, but He turned the cup in his hands. I thought Walsh was right, that you'd quit inside a week. A lot of people thought that, she said. I shouldn't have. She looked at him. He looked back. He was a different type than Craddock. Not young, not easy with his feelings, the kind of man who'd spent decades keeping his inner life compressed to a manageable size. This was costing him something. The stew could use more salt, she said. The shaker's on the shelf. He blinked. Then he understood that she was giving him something to do instead of making him stand there in his apology, and his shoulders dropped slightly with relief. Right, he said. Sure. He got the salt. She went back to her dough, and neither of them said anything else about it. But when the morning's first meal went out and the trailmen ate it without complaint, and Denny was the one who'd seasoned it, he stood a little differently than he had before. Jinchum. Walsh came to her on the afternoon of the third day, while the wind outside had momentarily dropped to something almost bearable. He came in and sat at the table and folded his hands and looked at them. Walsh never fidgeted. His stillness was the kind that came from long years of not having the luxury of nervous movement, and it made him hard to read, but she'd had 3 days of close quarters with him and she was getting better at it. Briggs is thinking about Reuben, he said. The trail cook's hands? She'd heard they were bad. Frostbite took the tips of 2 fingers. He won't be cooking again. Not professionally. Walsh's voice was neutral, delivering facts. Briggs is going to need to make arrangements. She kept peeling the potatoes in front of her. All right. He's going to ask you, Walsh said. She looked up. Ask me what? To stay on permanent, not just housekeeper. Full cook. Both jobs. He paused. Different pay. She set down the potato. He hasn't asked yet. He will. Walsh looked out the window. The light was flat and white, the sky still locked down with cloud. I told him he should, before he doesn't. He paused. Before some other outfit does. She looked at him carefully. You told him that? I told him exactly that. He met her eyes. I'll tell you what I told him. I misjudged you. I do that sometimes with people, and I'm not shy about saying so when I'm wrong. He unfolded his hands and put them on the table. This ranch has been running short on everything that matters for 2 years. Not cattle, not land, the other things. Reuben's a good cook, but he's never been what you are. He seemed to struggle briefly with the sentence. The men are different. 3 days and they're different. They're just fed, she said. It's not the food, Walsh said. Or not only. He pushed back from the table. Briggs will ask. I wanted you to know it's coming so you don't say no out of surprise. He left. Hazel sat at the table for a long moment, the half-peeled potato in her hands, looking at the window and the white world beyond it. She thought about Reuben. 2 fingers. That was the kind of loss that redrew a person's future, whether they wanted it redrawn or not. She knew something about that. About waking up and finding that the body you'd always relied on had quietly renegotiated its terms while you were sleeping. She thought about Lily, asleep in the back room, who had spent 6 years following her mother from one precarious arrangement to the next, and had never once complained about it, but who drew pictures, when given paper, of houses with the same 4 walls every time. She thought about the men in the bunkhouse who'd come in from the storm and found this kitchen lit and warm and full of food, and the way their faces had changed in that first moment. Not gratitude exactly, but recognition. like something they'd forgotten existed had suddenly been made real again. She picked up the potato and kept peeling. Outside, the wind had dropped further, and for the first time in 3 days she could see the mountains to the west. Just barely, just the silhouette, dark against the pale sky. The storm was breaking up. Not yet, but the direction was clear. Things were moving, one way or another. She put the peeled potatoes in the pot, covered them with water, and set it on the range. She measured flour into the bowl for the evening's cornbread. She added the salt without measuring because she'd been doing this long enough that her hands knew the right amount without being told. She worked, and the stove put out its heat, and the kitchen smelled of what was coming, and through the window the mountains held their ground against the breaking storm. The storm broke on the 4th morning. Not gently. Nothing about that winter was gentle, but the wind dropped sometime before dawn, and when the men began stirring in the bunkhouse and making their way to the main house for breakfast, they came through a silence that felt strange after 3 days of constant howling. The snow had stopped. The sky was the particular hard blue that comes after a serious storm, the kind of blue that has no warmth in it at all, just clarity. Everything was buried and still and bright. Hazel stood at the kitchen window with her first cup of coffee and looked at it. She was tired in a way that had gone past the kind of tired you sleep off. It had settled into her bones, into the tissue of her, a deep-level exhaustion that she recognized and knew better than to pretend wasn't there. Her ankles were worse than they'd been before the blizzard, both of them now, not just the right, and the swelling had moved up toward her calves in a way she didn't like. When she'd gotten up that morning and put her feet on the floor, she'd had to sit on the edge of the bed for a full minute before trusting herself to stand. She'd stood anyway. She'd laced her boots carefully, the way you do when you know the boots are doing more work than the legs inside them. She'd come to the kitchen and started the fire. There were still 27 people on this ranch. The trailmen couldn't leave until the road out of the canyon was passable, which Walsh estimated would take another day of settled weather at minimum. Reuben was in the bunkhouse with his bandaged hands and his damaged future. Colton had said nothing more about the permanent arrangement since Walsh's warning the day before, and she hadn't pushed it. There were meals to make. That was the immediate fact. And she'd learned over the past months that the immediate fact was the only one worth thinking about when everything else was uncertain. Lily came padding into the kitchen in her stocking feet and leaned against Hazel's hip without saying anything. She was warm from sleep, and her hair was tangled, and she smelled like the wool blanket she'd been wrapped in. "Morning," Hazel said. "Morning." Lily looked out the window at the blue sky and the buried world. It stopped. It stopped. "Will the men leave today?" "Not today. Maybe tomorrow." Lily considered this. "Amos told me a story last night," she said. Hazel looked down at her. "What kind of story?" "About a mountain and a woman who lived on it by herself and kept a fire going for 40 days so that travelers could find their way." She paused. "He said it was a real story. Amos tells a lot of stories. He said the woman wasn't trying to be brave. She was just cold and the fire was warm, and she figured other people were probably cold too." Lily looked up at her mother. "Is that true? That sometimes you do brave things and you're not even trying to?" Hazel looked at her daughter for a moment, 6 years old and already asking questions that didn't have clean answers. "Sometimes," she said. "Go put your boots on. It's cold in here." The morning was chaotic in the particular way of 27 people in a confined space who had been confined for too long. The trailmen were restless and grateful to be alive and warm, but the particular restlessness of men who work outside and have been trapped inside for 3 days was starting to show in small frictions. 2 of them got into a disagreement over a card game that had been going since the second night. One of the ranch hands broke a bridle ring trying to fix it in the cold and spent an hour being loudly unhappy about it. Sparky burned his hand on the stove trying to help with breakfast and had to be talked down from a level of distress that was, Hazel thought privately, somewhat disproportionate to the burn, which was minor. She gave him a cloth soaked in cold water and told him to keep it on for 15 minutes and find something to do with his other hand. "It really hurts," he said. "I know. Like a lot." 15 minutes, she said. "Then it'll ease." He sat at the corner table with the cloth on his hand and his expression of aggrieved suffering, and Lily, who had come back in her boots, sat across from him and watched him with the detached scientific interest of a child studying an unfamiliar species. "Does it feel like fire?" Lily asked. "Yeah," Sparky said. "Mama burns herself sometimes. She doesn't make a face." Sparky looked at Hazel. Hazel kept stirring the oatmeal. "She's real tough," Sparky said, in a tone that had shifted from self-pity to something more reflective. "She's not tough," Lily said in the matter-of-fact way children say things that are more accurate than they realize. "She just keeps going." Hazel did not turn around, but she felt the back of her neck get warm in a way that had nothing to do with the stove. Colton asked her after the midday meal. He waited until the kitchen had cleared and Lily had gone with Denny to see the horses. Denny had started this habit on the second day of the storm, taking the girl out to the barn in the brief windows when the wind allowed, letting her pet the horses' noses and feed them hay, which served the double purpose of entertaining Lily and giving Hazel an uninterrupted hour, though nobody said the second part aloud. He came in and poured himself a cup of coffee from the dregs of the pot, which meant it was strong enough to strip paint, and he sat down at the table. Hazel was writing out her supply inventory. What had been used, what remained, what needed ordering before the next stretch of bad weather. He put both hands around the cup and looked at the table for a moment. "Walsh talked to you," he said. It wasn't a question. "He mentioned you might have something to ask." Colton looked briefly skyward in the expression of a man whose foreman occasionally overstepped in ways he couldn't entirely argue with. He wasn't supposed to. He was trying to help. He does that. He drank his terrible coffee without wincing, which she respected. "I want you to stay on. Not just the house. Everything. What Reuben did, combined with what you've been doing. There'd be more money. The room you have is yours for as long as you want it. Lily can—" He paused. "There's a school in Carrow Wells, 12 miles east. Some of the men's kids go there. Wagon goes on Fridays." She kept writing for a moment. Then she set down her pencil. "You know I'm not well," she said. "I know. It may get worse before it gets better. Some days I won't be what you need me to be. I understand that. I'm not saying this to talk you out of it," she said. "I'm saying it so that we understand each other. I don't want to be let go in February because you decided you wanted someone healthier." His jaw tightened slightly. "That's not how I operate." "I don't know how you operate yet. We've known each other 11 days. He looked at her. There was something in his eyes that she was starting to understand was not coldness, but rather the expression of a man who had learned to carry things without showing the weight. "Fair," he said. "Then let me say it plainly. I'm not offering you this because I feel sorry for you. I'm offering it because you fed 27 men through a 3-day blizzard while you were running on whatever you run on when everything else runs out. And because Walsh hasn't voluntarily picked up a dish towel in 15 years, and he picked one up for you, which means something I can't put a wage figure on." She was quiet. "I'm also—" He stopped. Started again. "Lily needs a place to stay for a while. I think you know that." It was a simple thing to say, and it hit her in a place she'd been keeping defended for months, and she had to look down at her inventory list for a moment before she could answer. "I'll stay," she said. He nodded, got up. At the door, "The supply order goes out when the road clears. Write down everything you need." "I already started." "Of course you did." He said it without sarcasm, just a quiet acknowledgement, and he left, and she looked at the list in front of her and added 3 things she'd been hesitating to put down because they seemed like too much to ask for. She put them down anyway. The trailmen began leaving the next morning in groups as the road out of the canyon was reported passable by Cord, who'd ridden out at first light to check. They came through the kitchen one last time for breakfast and for the biscuits and dried apple preserves she'd made with the last of the forgotten apple rings from the storage shed. And they left the way men leave places they've been unexpectedly well treated, with a certain roughness over the top of something softer, not sure how to name what they felt, but knowing they felt something. Cord shook her hand at the door. His grip was firm, and he looked at her directly when he did it, which she took as the highest compliment a man like him knew how to give. "You need anything," he said, "and you send word to the Cord Hallett outfit in Santa Caro. We'll know about it." "Thank you." "No." He shook his head once. "Thank you." Amos Tidd was the last to leave, because he was always the last to do anything. Not from slowness of mind, but from a general refusal to rush that had calcified into principle over 60-some years. He came through the kitchen in his layered coats and his ice-crusted hat and stopped at the door and looked at her. "You'll be all right here," he said. "I expect so." The boy, he meant Colton, which struck her as funny given that Colton was close to 40. "He's decent, stubborn as a fence post and not always easy to read, but decent underneath." He squinted at her. "Give him time to show it." "I'm not in any hurry." Amos made a sound that was approximately a laugh. "No, I don't suppose you are." He touched the brim of his hat and went out, and she watched him cross the yard to where his horse waited, moving with that slow, careful dignity of a man who has decided to take up exactly the amount of space his body requires, and no more. That afternoon was the quietest Iron Mesa had been since she'd arrived. The quiet was when it caught up to her. It always worked that way. The body held itself together through the crisis by some mechanism she'd never fully understood, some internal rationing system that redirected what resources remained toward whatever was most necessary, and then when the necessity eased, the bill came due all at once. She'd seen it in the railroad camps. She'd felt it herself in the days after Marcus died, when she'd gotten through the funeral and the arrangements and the terrible paperwork with a steadiness that had surprised even herself, and then sat down alone in the kitchen at 11 at night and found she couldn't lift her own hands off the table. She made it through dinner that evening. The ranch hands, just the 8 of them now, plus Colton, the sudden spaciousness of the normal. And through the cleanup, and she got Lily settled in their room with her drawing paper and the stub of a good candle. And then she went back to the kitchen to bank the stove for the night. And she sat down on the stool near the range, just for a moment, just to check that everything was as it should be. She woke with her head on her folded arms on the kitchen table, which meant she'd made it from the stool to the table at some point without being aware of it. The stove had banked itself down to coals. The kitchen was dark, except for the orange glow from the firebox door and a gray square of window where the moon had come out somewhere above the lingering clouds. Her neck ached, her back ached. Her legs were 2 dull columns of complaint. She sat up carefully and looked at the window and tried to determine the time from the moon's position, which she'd never been especially good at. Late was as specific as she could get. Not yet midnight, probably. Colton was sitting in the chair across the table. She startled, just slightly, not enough to be embarrassing. "You were here," she said. "Came to bank the stove," he said. "You were already asleep." She looked at the stove. "You banked it." "Yes." "You should have woken me." "No," he said. "I shouldn't have." She sat with that for a moment. He was in the dark and she couldn't read his face well, just the outline of him. The set of his shoulders, the stillness that was his default mode. "How long was I asleep?" "About 2 hours." She absorbed this. "Lily, I checked on her an hour ago. She's asleep. She'd put herself to bed." A pause. "Your daughter is remarkably self-sufficient." "She's had to be." Another silence. The stove ticked as the metal cooled. "You can go to bed," she said. "I'm fine now." He didn't move. "You said that the night the riders came in. You said you were fine. You also said it when I found you at the window. You say it a lot." "Because I am, generally." "You fell asleep at the kitchen table." "I was tired." "Hazel." His voice was quiet, not sharp. "You don't have to perform for me. Not tonight. There's nobody here watching." She looked at him across the dark table. He was right, and she knew he was right. And she also knew that the habit of performance, of the steady face, the even voice, the "I'm fine," was so deep in her now that she wasn't sure she could turn it off the way she would a lamp. It had been keeping her alive since March. You didn't just set it aside because someone said there was nobody watching. "I'm more tired than usual," she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said to anyone in months, and it came out sounding small and insufficient. "All right," he said. "The legs are bad tonight, both of them." "All right. I'll be better in the morning." "Probably," he said. "And if you're not, we'll manage." He said it like it was simple, which she knew it wasn't, but the simplicity of the way he said it made something in her chest loosen slightly. She pushed back from the table. "I'm going to bed." He stood too. "I'll walk you. I know the way," she said. But she said it without edge, just as a fact. and he nodded and didn't insist. She made it to the doorway and stopped. "Colton." He looked at her. "The apple preserves," she said. "I know they went fast. I'll make more when the next supply order comes in." He looked at her for a moment. "Good night, Hazel." "Good night." She went to bed. The week that followed was the real test, and she knew it even at the time. The dramatic part, the storm, the riders, the night of cooking, that was the kind of thing people remembered and told stories about. What came after was harder to talk about because it was ordinary. It was just day after day of getting up and doing the work, and the work was real and substantial, and her body was fighting it every step, and there was no audience and no crisis to make the difficulty legible to anyone watching. She was cooking 3 meals a day for 9 people, managing the household stores, keeping the main house in order and the cookhouse supplied, planning ahead for the supply order, and doing all of it while her ankles swelled and her heart did its irregular, unreliable thing, and the fatigue came and went in waves she couldn't predict. Some mornings she got up and felt nearly like herself. Those mornings she moved fast, did more than required, got ahead of things. Some mornings she got up and the world seemed to be happening at a slight remove, like watching it through gauze, and she moved carefully and slowly and made simpler food and told no one. The men around her adjusted without being asked. Not perfectly, not without friction, but they adjusted. Sparky had taken over the wood box. This had just happened, wordlessly, sometime during the blizzard, and had continued afterward. He kept it filled without being reminded, and without making a thing of it. Denny had started handling the morning water haul from the well, which saved her 2 trips through the cold and probably saved her ankles more than she'd say. Walsh continued his unpredictable appearances in the kitchen, doing specific tasks. He was best at the mechanical, structural parts of cooking, things that required precision rather than intuition, and then disappearing back to his foreman duties without ceremony. None of them talked about it directly. Nobody said, "I'm doing this because you're not well," or "I've noticed you're struggling." They just did the things, and she let them, and the kitchen ran. Colton came in most evenings after supper had been cleared. He didn't always have a reason. He'd have coffee, or he'd look at the supply list, or he'd stand at the window a while looking at the dark. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. She found she didn't mind either way, which was unusual for her. She'd always needed a certain amount of quiet to herself, and most company felt like additional weight. His didn't, particularly. He was a man who'd learned to exist in silence without filling it up, and she found that compatible with how she moved through her evenings. One night he told her about the ranch. Not the operational facts, those she was already learning, but the shape of the thing, how it had come to be what it was, and what it had been before. His father had built it, he said. A difficult man in the way that frontier builders often were. Relentless, a little ruthless, not warm. He'd died 7 years ago and left Colton a property that was profitable and competent and had no, he searched for the word, character. It ran like a machine and felt like one. "Walsh has been here longer than me," Colton said. "He knew my father before I did, practically. He stayed after because he's the kind of man who stays." A pause. "But even Walsh will tell you that something's been off here for a while. Not the cattle, not the land, something else." She was peeling potatoes at the table. "What do you think it was?" He thought about it. "Nobody ate together like they meant it," he said. "A meal was just a thing that happened between work. You ate and went back. Nobody talked." He looked at his cup. "Last 3 days of the storm, those men were talking to each other. Not just complaining, talking. The Ruiz brothers told stories. Old Tate sang something after supper that second night. He can't carry a tune, but he tried. Sparky laughed so hard he fell off his chair." He shook his head. "I don't know exactly what you did to cause that." "I fed them," she said. "It's not the food." "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." She put a potato in the pot, picked up another. "When people eat food someone made with actual effort," she said slowly, "they feel it. Not always consciously, but there's a difference between something made by someone who cares whether it's right and something made by someone pulling the short stick." She paused. "People feel cared for and they act differently. It's not complicated." He was quiet for a while. Then, "You always know that? Or did you figure it out?" "Figured it out," she said. "The hard way. In the Colorado high country when I was 19, with 40 hungry men and not enough food and no idea whether I was doing anything right. She kept peeling. By the third week, I stopped worrying about the food and started worrying about the men, whether they were cold, whether they were scared, whether they'd lost hope. A pause. And the meals got better, even though the supplies didn't. He looked at her for a long time. "That's a strange kind of alchemy," he said. "It's just paying attention," she said. "Most people stop doing it because it's exhausting. But if you stop, you start making food that's only food, and that's not enough." She put the potato in the pot and reached for the last one. "That's what was missing here," he said. It came out quiet, like something he was saying to himself as much as to her. She didn't answer because some things are better left to settle on their own without a reply. Reuben came to the kitchen on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the storm. He knocked at the door frame before coming in, which was unusual. Most men didn't bother. He was a compact, dark-haired man in his 50s with an economy of movement that even the bandaged hands hadn't entirely taken from him. He came and sat at the table and put his hands on the surface, both still wrapped, though the bandaging was down to just the 2 damaged fingers now, and looked at them a moment. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," Hazel said. She poured him coffee without asking. "I was angry," he said, "when I heard about the arrangement, about you taking on the cooking." He looked up. His eyes were direct and without self-pity, which she appreciated. "I was here for 11 years. I did that job for 11 years and then 2 fingers, and I'm in the bunkhouse while somebody else has my kitchen. I was angry." "That's reasonable," she said. "I'm not saying it to excuse it. I'm saying it because I was wrong about you, the way a man can be wrong about somebody before he's seen them work. And I want to say that." He picked up the cup with both wrapped hands carefully. "Walsh told me what happened, the night of the storm. He told me in detail." A pause. "Rye bread from forage grain," he said. "Colorado, '03. She looked at him. "I was on the crew the year after," he said. "Not the same crew, different company. But the men from that survey talked about that cook for a year. She kept the fire going for 22 days. He drank. "I didn't know you were her until Walsh told me." "It was a long time ago," she said. "Good cooking doesn't get old," he said. "Simply the way a craftsman says something about a craft. I've been doing this since I was 16. I know what it means to keep people fed when there's not enough, and the weather's against you and your bodies, not what it used to be." He looked at his hands. "I know something about that now, I guess." She sat down across from him. "What will you do?" He shrugged with one shoulder. "Can still do the trail boss work. Walsh has been after Briggs to split the job for years anyway. Says one man doing both was always too much." He paused. "He's probably right. Walsh is usually right, which is irritating." She almost smiled at that. "I wanted to say—" He stopped, tried again. "This is still a kitchen that deserves to be treated right. And from what I hear, you're doing that." He said it carefully, the way you say something you've been carrying for a while and have finally decided to put down. "So, all right." She understood what he meant. It wasn't quite approval. It was something smaller and more specific than that. An acknowledgement. One cook to another. "The range needs the left burner adjusted," she said. "It's running hot. I've been compensating, but it should be fixed properly." He looked up. "Sparky mentioned you used to do the maintenance on it," she said. Something moved behind his eyes. "I did." "Could you still? With the hands?" He looked at his wrapped fingers, flexed them slightly, testing. "Probably. The adjustment's minor. Mostly a wrench." "I'd appreciate it," she said. "When you're ready." He nodded. He finished his coffee and got up and stood at the door a moment. "The cornbread," he said. "The molasses ratio. You use more than most." "I do." "Makes it better," he said. "I always went lighter on it than I should have." He said it as though it were a professional note, neutral and precise. "I'll show you the ratio sometime," she said. He made a sound that wasn't a yes or a no. He left. She sat at the table for a moment after. The kitchen was warm and smelled of this morning's bread and the coffee she'd just poured, and beneath that the permanent smell of the place. Wood and iron and the accumulated history of years of meals. She thought about what Colton had said, about character, about a place that ran like a machine and felt like one. She thought about Reuben coming to her door, about Craddock with his hat in his hands, about Walsh at the wash basin at 2 in the morning, rough hands cutting biscuit dough he didn't know how to cut, about Sparky and the woodbox, about Denny carrying water without being asked. She had not changed these men. She was clear-eyed enough to know that. People didn't change because of one woman and one blizzard and a week's worth of good meals. What happened was smaller than change. It was more like a shift in the light. The same room, the same furniture, but the angle of the sun different enough that you saw things you hadn't noticed were there before. She got up, checked the bread. The loaves were rising right, not too fast, not slow. The dough skin taut and smooth in the way that meant the yeast was doing its job. She'd know in another hour whether they were right. There was always an hour where you didn't know yet. You'd done everything correctly and the outcome was still open. That was the nature of bread, and the nature of most things. You did the work, and then you waited, and you didn't get to know ahead of time how it came out. She could live with that. She'd been living with it for as long as she could remember. She went back to the table and picked up the supply list and began adding the things she'd been holding off on. More lard, more sugar. She'd been rationing the sugar since she arrived, and there was no need to ration if she was staying, and she was staying. Dried fruit if there was any to be had, which in January in the territory was doubtful but worth requesting. A proper medical kit with bandages and the kind of salve that actually worked, because what they had in the house was inadequate. A second apron, because one was not enough. She wrote it all down. Outside, the blue sky was holding. The snow on the ground had crusted overnight into something firm and permanent looking, the kind of surface that crunched underfoot and caught the light and made the whole ranch look cleaner than it was. 2 of the ranch hands were visible from the window, moving between the outbuildings. She could see Walsh near the corral, his breath making white clouds, gesturing at something. Normal morning, normal life. She finished the list, folded it, set it where Colton would see it. Then she went to check the bread. The supply order came back 12 days after she'd written it. Sparky drove the wagon into the yard on a gray Tuesday afternoon, and she heard it from the kitchen and came out to the porch to watch it come in. He'd been gone 2 days. The roads were passable now, but slow. The snow packed down to a firm rut-cut track that required care, and he pulled up looking tired and cold and pleased with himself in the way of someone who has completed a mission and knows it. "Everything on the list?" she called. He jumped down. "Everything except the dried apricots. Man at the store said he won't see those until March." "That's all right." He sent dried cherries instead, said they were better anyway. "Debatable," she said, but she was already moving toward the wagon to check the crates, and when she found the second apron folded on top of the first dry goods box, exactly where she'd have put it herself, she stood for a moment with her hands on the wagon rail and felt something she didn't have a precise word for. Not relief, not quite. Something more like the physical sensation of a door opening onto a room where the air is better. Walsh appeared from the direction of the barn and began helping unload without being asked, which was still, 3 weeks into this new arrangement, something she hadn't entirely gotten used to. She accepted it without comment and started telling him what went where. The medical kit was at the bottom of the second crate, wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it at the kitchen table that evening after supper and took stock. Proper bandaging, a tin of drawing salve that was better than what they'd had, a small bottle of laudanum for genuine emergencies, which she put on the high shelf immediately and intended to forget about unless things became dire. And this surprised her. A bottle of a tonic she recognized. It was the one the doctor and Holt had recommended for her condition, the one she hadn't been able to afford since October. There was no note with it, no indication of who had included it or why. She held the bottle for a long moment, looked at the door. Then she put it in her apron pocket and went back to the dishes. She didn't mention it to Colton, neither did he. But the next morning, when she came to the kitchen and found him already there with the stove going, he'd beaten her up, which had never happened before. He looked at her and said, "How are your legs today?" And the question was so direct and so free of performance that she answered it honestly. "Worse than yesterday," she said. "Better than last week." He nodded and moved away from the stove so she could get to it. "There's coffee already." "I see that." She poured a cup and he poured one, and they stood on either side of the range in the early dark with their coffee and the stove between them. And it was, she thought, a strangely comfortable thing to be doing with a man she'd known less than a month. February arrived cold and settled and consistent, which was its own kind of mercy after January's violence. The ranch moved back into its rhythms, the men out to the pastures, the daily work of maintaining animals and equipment, and ground through the back half of winter, the particular suspended quality of ranch life in the cold months when you were mostly waiting for spring and trying not to break anything in the meantime. Hazel moved back into her rhythms too, or found new ones that fit the place. The early mornings with the fire, and the bread dough. The midday meal that she'd learned to calibrate precisely for what the men had been doing that morning. The afternoons that were partly hers if she managed the morning right. The evenings that had gradually become something she looked forward to instead of just endured. Lily had started on the school wagon to Carroll Wells on Fridays, which was a development that produced an intense and complicated response in Lily herself. Excitement about the going, deep ambivalence about the actual being there, and a detailed report each Friday evening that went on for 45 minutes and covered everything from the quality of the teacher's chalk to the social dynamics of a girl named Prudence, who was, apparently, an ongoing situation. She took my pencil, Lily said on the third Friday, eating her supper. Did you get it back? Hazel asked. Yes. Sparky showed me how to write my name really big on things so they know it's mine. Hazel looked at Sparky, who was eating across the table and was now studying his biscuit with great interest. Sparky, she said. It's a useful skill, he said to the biscuit. She's 6. Prudence is apparently 9 and aggressive. Denny, beside him, made a sound that was definitely not a laugh, and then coughed. Lily, who had followed this exchange with the alert attention of a child who understands she is the subject of it, looked at Sparky. Will you show me again, the name writing? After supper, Sparky said. Sparky, Hazel said. She needs to know it, he said, with the conviction of a 17-year-old who has made up his mind. The frontier's a rough place. She's going to school in Carroll Wells, not the frontier. Same thing, Denny muttered. This time 3 men laughed, and Lily grinned, and Hazel looked at her supper and did not allow herself to smile because someone had to maintain standards around here, and it had apparently defaulted to her. These were the evenings now. This was what the kitchen had become. She hadn't engineered it. She wasn't that deliberate about human beings, she'd have said. But she had created a space, and people had moved into it, and the thing that filled it was ordinary and imperfect and loud and occasionally genuinely funny. She hadn't had that since Marcus. She hadn't been sure she'd have it again. But the offer came in the 3rd week of February. She heard about it secondhand first, the way things moved on a ranch. Through the specific acoustic quality of 2 men talking near the barn when they thought nobody was within earshot. She caught only fragments, Mallory outfit, asking after her. Good money, they said. She didn't ask and wasn't told directly, and she let it sit. Colton told her 2 days later on a Thursday evening in the kitchen. He came in after the others had gone and sat at the table in his usual chair and was quiet for long enough that she knew whatever he was going to say was something he'd been turning over. She kept working. She was rendering lard, which required attention but not conversation, and let him find his way to it. Victor Mallory came by today, he said. She knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. The Mallory operation was the largest cattle outfit within 100 miles. 3 ranches consolidated under one management, a bunkhouse that housed 40 men at peak season, money and influence that made Iron Mesa look modest by comparison. He'd heard about the blizzard, Colton said. About what you did. Word travels, she said. Cord Hallett talked to somebody who talked to somebody. He paused. Mallory wants a head cook for the consolidated kitchen. It's a real operation. They feed 60 men on the busy months. He's offering a wage that's... He stopped, looked at the table. It's considerably more than I'm paying you. She kept stirring. The lard was going clear, which meant it was almost done. What did you tell him? She said. I told him it was your decision, that I wasn't going to speak for you. He said it evenly, like he'd practiced keeping the feeling out of it. I also told him you'd been sick and he should know that before making an offer. She looked up at that. You told him? Yes. Why? Because I didn't want him to make you an offer based on an incomplete picture and then have it become a problem later. His voice was flat and factual. And because I told you when you took the job here that I don't operate by letting people go when things get hard. I wanted to make sure he understood the same courtesy applies to you in any arrangement. He picked up his coffee cup. I should have asked before telling him. That was my call to make, and I should have asked you first. She turned back to the lard, took the pan off the heat. 60 men, she said. 60 at peak. More like 40 in February. That's a serious kitchen. Yes. She poured the rendered lard carefully into the crock, watching the surface go still and pale. I spent 6 months cooking for that kind of volume once. It's a different operation than this. More about systems, less about individual meals. She set the pan down. You stop being able to know what each person needs. Colton said nothing. Here I know Tate's teeth hurt when he eats anything too hard and I adjust, she said. I know the Ruiz brothers take their coffee without sugar, and it matters to them that I remember. I know Sparky eats more when he's anxious about something, and I can usually figure out what's making him anxious by how much he eats. She looked at the crock. You can't know those things about 60 men. No, Colton agreed quietly. The money's more. Significantly. She wiped her hands on her apron, turned to face him. He was watching her with that careful stillness of his, not pushing, not trying to influence the direction. She thought about what Amos Tidd had said. He's decent, stubborn as a fence post and not always easy to read. She'd found the first part to be accurate and had her own opinions about the second, which was that he was easy enough to read once you stopped expecting him to say things the way other people said them. I'm going to tell Mallory no, she said. His expression didn't change, but something around his eyes shifted. Just barely, the way something relaxes that you hadn't noticed was tense. All right, he said. I want more money, though. He blinked. Then after a moment, how much more? She told him. He was quiet for a few seconds. That's reasonable, she said. Given what I'm doing, and given what Mallory's offering, and given that I just turned down Mallory. He looked at her. A corner of his mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. You negotiated with Mallory's offer without taking it. Yes. You had this ready. I've been thinking about it since you said his name. He was quiet for a moment longer, then he nodded. Done. She turned back to the stove. Tell him thank you for the consideration. I'll tell him you're committed to your current position. That too, she said. Walsh heard about the Mallory offer the same way he heard about most things, through the ambient intelligence of a man who had worked the same property for decades and knew its communication patterns the way he knew its fence lines. He came to her the next morning while she was making breakfast and stood near the door in a way that meant he had something to say and wasn't sure how to start. She handed him a task, slicing bread, which he could do adequately, and let him think about it while he worked. Mallory would have been a good opportunity, he said finally. It would have been a different opportunity, she said. More money. I got more money here. He looked at her sideways. You negotiated. I did. A pause. The bread got sliced. Briggs agreed? He agreed. Walsh made a sound that communicated several things at once. Satisfaction, mild surprise, and a kind of private acknowledgement of something he'd suspected. He put the sliced bread on the board and brushed the crumbs into his palm and dropped them in the scrap bucket and said, Good. That was the end of that conversation. But later, when she was washing up the midday dishes and Walsh was on his way out through the back hall, he stopped at the door and said, without turning around, I told Briggs 2 years ago this place needed a different kind of person. He kept hiring for muscle. I kept telling him muscle wasn't what was missing. He paused. He doesn't always listen to me on the first round. He got there eventually. He went out. She stood at the wash basin with her hands in the water and thought about that for a while. Craddock had been the first to apologize. Walsh had been the most direct about having misjudged her. But it was Tate, old Tate, the bow-legged one who'd been on this ranch longer than anyone except Walsh, who said the thing that stayed with her longest. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in late February. Most of the men were off duty, which on a winter Sunday meant they were in the bunkhouse playing cards or sleeping or engaged in the low-level argumentation that was the natural state of a group of men with nothing specific to do. Hazel was in the kitchen doing the kind of deep organizing work she did when she had an extra hour, inventorying, checking the stores against what was expected to come in the next supply run, planning ahead. Tate came in for coffee and stayed because he was old and it was warm and he had no real reason to be elsewhere. He sat in the corner chair and held his cup in both hands and watched her work with the mild observational quality of someone who has enough years behind him that watching other people do things is a legitimate entertainment. After a while, he said, "You remind me of my mother." She looked at him. He was somewhere between 65 and 75. It was hard to say, with men who'd spent their lives outside, and his face was so weathered it had a kind of geological character, like something shaped by forces rather than time. She was a large woman, he said, without self-consciousness. Strong when she needed to be. Sick a good part of the time. My father wasn't present, mostly. She kept us going, kept the house. He drank his coffee. I grew up thinking that was just what mothers were. Took me a long time to understand it was particular to her, that a lot of women in her position would have just stopped, given up the effort, and she didn't. Hazel turned back to her inventory. "I wasn't kind to you when you got here," he said. "I didn't say anything bad, but I thought it, that you wouldn't last, that Briggs had made a mistake." He paused. "I watched you that first supper and I thought, she's struggling to stand and she's making a good supper. And I ate it, and I didn't say anything, and I went to bed. I should have said something then." "You didn't owe me anything then," she said. "We'd just met." "I owed you basic decency," he said. "Which I gave you eventually, but not that first week." He turned the cup in his hands. "My mother never got enough credit for what she did. People in the town, they saw the size of her, and they made up their mind about what kind of woman she was before they saw anything else." He looked at his coffee. "She was the most capable person I ever knew, and she spent her life in a town that thought of her as a curiosity at best." He set the cup down. "I'm sorry for thinking the same thing about you before I knew better." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. "Your mother," Hazel said. "What was her name?" He looked up, a little surprised by the question. "Dorothea," he said. Dorothea Tate. She sounds like someone worth knowing." Something moved across his face. "She was," he said. "She absolutely was." He picked up his cup and finished his coffee and got up and went. And Hazel stood at the kitchen table for a moment with her inventory list in her hands and thought about a woman named Dorothea in a town somewhere who had done the same work that she was doing, had done it sick and undervalued and without credit, and thought about how these things moved through generations like water moving through stone, slow and persistent and real. She went back to the inventory. There was always more to count. March came in with a softening. It wasn't warm. It was still the territory, still February's cousin in terms of temperature most days. But the quality of the light changed, and the snow began to have a different texture, and the mornings started to let go of their hardest cold a little earlier each day. These were the signals that people who lived close to the land read without thinking about it, the way the body learns to read its own small signs. Hazel's body had some of its own signals in those first days of March. The swelling in her ankles was down, not gone. She doubted it would be gone entirely for a long while, if ever, but measurably reduced. The particular sharp pain above the right ankle joint, which had been a constant companion since before she'd arrived at Iron Mesa, had retreated to an occasional presence rather than a daily one. Her breathing was cleaner. The dropping sensation in her chest, the one that came when she'd pushed too hard, had not visited her in 10 days. She didn't say anything about it because she was too cautious for that, but she noticed. She thought it was the tonic, partially. It was also the sleep. She was sleeping more consistently than she had in months, full nights with Lily warm beside her, without the anxiety-driven waking at 2 and 3 in the morning that had been her norm through the Kansas winter. It was the food, which she could finally cook to her own standards and her own nutritional instincts, rather than making do with what a boarding house put in front of her. It was possibly the work itself, which was hard but purposeful, the kind of hard that builds rather than erodes. Bodies were mysterious, and she'd stopped trying to fully explain hers. She just noted the direction. Reuben fixed the left burner on the range on a Thursday in early March. He came in the morning with his tools and worked at it steadily for an hour. His bandaged hands, the bandaging reduced now to just the 2 damaged fingers, which had healed as well as they were going to, managing the wrench with the adaptation of a man who'd decided the limitation was a fact and not a sentence. He tested the burner twice, made a small additional adjustment, tested it again. "Try it," he told her. She put her hand above the surface. The heat was even now, spreading consistently across the entire burner rather than concentrating on the left side. "Good," she said. "Should have been done in October," he said. "I kept meaning to get to it." "You were managing 2 jobs." Still, he gathered his tools. He was a tidy worker, she'd noticed. Things went back exactly where they came from. No waste motion. "The molasses ratio," he said, without looking up from the toolbox. 1 to 3? 1 to 3.5, she said, "and a pinch of salt in the dry mix." He paused, looked up. "Salt. Just a pinch. It sharpens everything else." He considered this with the serious expression of a person receiving professional information. "Huh," he said. He closed the toolbox. "I might try that." "The cornbread's yours to make any time you want," she said. He picked up the toolbox and looked at her. For a moment, the two of them just stood in the kitchen. His kitchen first, hers now. Something between them that was neither competition nor simple friendship, but some specific hybrid of professional respect and shared purpose that didn't have a common name. "The salt," he said finally. "Makes sense." He went out. She turned to the newly even burner and put on the morning's pot of beans, which would be better now, the heat distributing correctly beneath them. Small improvement, worth having. The thing with Colton happened gradually, the way things do when both people involved are constitutionally disinclined to hurry. It wasn't a single moment. It was a series of them, small and undramatic, accumulating the way snow accumulates, each individual flake insufficient, the total unmistakable. It was the wood box he kept filled without mentioning it. It was the evenings in the kitchen that went from necessary to habitual to something he arranged his day around without acknowledging that he was doing so. It was the morning he came to breakfast, and Lily, who had been shy of him for the first 2 weeks, climbed onto the chair beside him without preamble and began telling him about Prudence's latest infraction as if he had standing to hear it, and he listened with the full attention of a man who has decided this small person's concerns are worth his time. It was the afternoon she came back from the root cellar to find him at the kitchen table helping Lily with the letters she was practicing. The child's hand on the paper, his over it, guiding the pencil through the curves of an S that Lily found especially vexing. He looked up when Hazel came in, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen there before. A kind of unguarded ease, the look of someone who has forgotten to be careful. He removed his hand from Lily's immediately, which made her suppress a smile and which he caught, and then looked away from. "She's working on her S," he said. "I see that." "It's hard," Lily said. "S is deceptive." "Where did you get that word?" Hazel asked. "Amos," Lily said. She went back to her letter. Hazel put down the things she'd brought from the root cellar and began sorting them. Colton stayed at the table a moment longer, then pushed back and stood. He hovered in the kitchen the way he sometimes did when he had something to say and hadn't worked out how to say it. "My father," he said, "he used this kitchen as a pass-through. He came in for meals and left. He didn't think the kitchen was a place for him, for the owner." He paused. "I did the same thing, for 7 years. She kept sorting the onions, separating the good from the ones that had gone soft. Walsh told me once that a ranch has a center of gravity," he said. He meant it about cattle management, where you put the water, where the animals naturally gather, but he said it applied to people too, that people need somewhere to gravitate toward, or they just scatter. He paused. He said this ranch didn't have one. She set aside a soft onion. "And now?" He looked at the kitchen, at Lily bent over her paper, at the stove and the morning's bread and the smell that had lived in this room for a month and a half now. "Now it does," he said. He left before she could respond, which she thought was typical of him, and also, she admitted to herself, a little cowardly, though she understood the impulse. Some things you said and then needed to not be present for the response because the response was beside the point. She stood at the kitchen table with an onion in her hand for a moment. Lily looked up from her letter. "What's a center of gravity?" she asked. "It's where things naturally want to be," Hazel said. Lily thought about this. "Like how I always come to the kitchen when I don't know what to do?" Yes, Hazel said. Exactly like that. Lily nodded, satisfied, and went back to the vexing S. Hazel put the onion in the pot and went back to work, and the kitchen was warm and loud with the small sounds of living, and outside the March light came through the window at a slightly better angle than it had in February, and she noticed that too, because she noticed things, and some of them were worth noticing. The question of what she was to this place and to the man who owned it was one she kept at a careful distance during those weeks. She was the cook. She was the housekeeper. She was, increasingly, the person the ranch organized itself around in the practical sense. Walsh brought supply questions to her. Reuben checked with her before ordering cookhouse materials. Even Denny had started consulting her on small things that were technically outside her role, as if her judgment had extended to cover ground she hadn't been given. This happened without announcement and without, as far as she could tell, anyone planning it. It was simply the outcome of being the person who showed up and knew things and didn't stop. She understood that the lines of her role had become blurry, and she wasn't sure how she felt about that. On one hand, it was a kind of trust that she hadn't been given since Marcus was alive, and it felt something like being seen. On the other hand, she was conscious of how quickly this kind of trust could reverse if circumstances changed, and she had learned from the last year that circumstances changed without warning and rarely in the direction you'd have chosen. She didn't say any of this to anyone. She filed it in the part of herself where she kept things that were important enough to monitor and unresolved enough that talking about them would only introduce noise. What she did instead was work. She planned the spring provision order, a more substantial undertaking than the winter one had been, because spring meant the ranch would be moving again, cattle driven to different pastures, men spending more time in the field, the cookhouse needing to supply food for work that burned calories at a different rate than winter maintenance. She made lists. She consulted Reuben and Walsh on historical usage. She cross-referenced what she knew about the men's preferences with what she knew about the season's demands, and found the intersection and ordered to it. She started a kitchen garden plan. Not for this spring, too early, and she didn't know the ground yet, but she spent an afternoon in the first real warmth of late March, walking the south-facing side of the property and taking note of where the soil was dark and where the drainage was right, and where there might be enough growing season to justify the effort. She brought back a pocketful of dirt and examined it at the kitchen table that evening. Colton watched this from his chair. "What are you doing?" he said. "Checking the soil." "From where?" "South side, below the storage shed." He leaned forward slightly. "You're thinking about a garden." "Thinking about it for next spring. This year's too late to start properly." He looked at the dirt on the table with the expression of a man recalibrating. Reuben always said a garden wasn't worth the trouble. "Reuben was wrong about the cornbread salt," she said. "He may have been wrong about the garden." A pause. "Fair," he said. She put the dirt in a small tin and labeled it with the location, because if you were going to do a thing, you did it right and left it on the windowsill. That evening, when she was almost asleep, she heard Lily's voice from the dark. "Mama." "Are we staying?" She opened her eyes at the ceiling. The room was dark and cold outside the blankets, and the ranch was quiet, just the small sounds that buildings make when they're settling in the cold. "Yes," she said. Lily was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. "I like my room." Hazel closed her eyes again. "Me too," she said. Spring came to Iron Mesa the way it always came to high country, reluctantly, in stages, with frequent reversals that made you doubt it was happening at all. There would be 3 warm days in a row, enough that the snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes, and the mud appeared and the horses got restless in the corral. Then a cold night would push back through and everything would frost over again, and the men would come to breakfast in their heavy coats and look at the sky with the expression of people who have been disappointed before and are managing their expectations. Then the warmth would return, a little stronger than before, and the cycle would repeat until one morning you walked outside and realized the air smelled different, like wet earth and new grass and something green underneath the cold, and you understood that the argument was settled. Hazel noticed it first from the kitchen window, the way she noticed most things about this place now, at a slight remove, through glass, while doing something else. The cottonwood at the edge of the yard had gone from bare to the first suggestion of leaf, that particular yellow-green that lasts only a few days before it deepens into real green, and she stood at the window with a bowl of biscuit dough in her arms and looked at it for a long moment before going back to work. 4 months. She had been at Iron Mesa for 4 months. That number sat in her mind with a weight she hadn't expected. The longest she'd been in one place since Marcus died. The longest Lily had slept in the same room, attended the same school, known the same people. She rolled the dough and thought about Dorothea Tate, who had spent a lifetime in one town and been seen by none of it. She thought about the railroad camp in Colorado and the 22 days that the men had talked about for years afterward. She had not known they were talking about it, had not known Amos Tidd would walk through a kitchen door 16 years later and recognize the bread. She thought about the things you do that you don't know matter while you're doing them, the way you keep moving because stopping isn't an option, and the moving turns out to be the whole thing. The biscuits went in the oven. She went to wake Lily. The conversation with Colton had been building for weeks, the way pressure builds in a system that has no good release valve. Not from hostility, but from the opposite, from two people who were being careful with something they didn't want to break. It happened on a Saturday evening in the first real week of spring, when the air had finally decided to stay warm past sundown. She'd sent Lily to the bunkhouse with Sparky, who had taken on the role of unofficial older brother with a commitment that suggested it filled something in him as much as in her. The kitchen was clean. The stove was banked. She was sitting on the back step with her coffee, the same place he'd found her that first week, the night he'd told her a storm was coming. And he came and sat beside her without being invited, which was also the same. They sat for a while in the not unpleasant silence that had become one of the reliable features of his company. The sky to the west was still holding the last of the light, a band of orange and deep red above the mountain line. The air smelled like thawed ground and horse and wood smoke. "Your legs are better," he said. "Most days. You're moving faster, I noticed." "You notice a lot," she said. "I pay attention to things on my property." She glanced at him. He was looking at the sky. "Is that what I am?" she said. "A thing on your property." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "That came out wrong." It did. He turned and looked at her. He had the expression of a man who has arrived at a moment he's been both moving toward and avoiding and has decided finally to stop avoiding it. "You know what I mean," he said. "I know what you mean," she agreed. "I'm waiting to see if you can say it." He looked at her for another long moment. His jaw worked slightly. She had learned that this was what happened when he was assembling something that resisted assembly. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not as the cook, not as the housekeeper." He paused. "As the person you are, here, with Lily." He stopped again. "I'm not saying this well." "You're saying it fine," she said, because he was actually, in the particular inarticulate way of a man who means what he says and doesn't know how to dress it up. "I just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing." "We're talking about the same thing," he said. She looked at her coffee cup. The orange had faded from the sky and the blue was deepening toward dark, the first stars beginning to show at the zenith. In the bunkhouse, she could hear Lily laughing at something. That specific full-body laugh the child had, the one that left no room for anything else. "I'm going to be sick sometimes," she said. "That's not going to change. Maybe it gets better, maybe it doesn't, but it's part of the arrangement." "I know that." "I'm not easy to manage. I don't do well with being managed." "I've noticed," he said dryly. "I have opinions about how things should be run." "Also noticed." "And Lily is part of it," he said. "Not a condition of it. Part of it." He said it with a directness that closed the question. She looked at him. He looked back. He was not a man who said things he didn't mean. She'd established that over 4 months. And the face he was showing her now was the unguarded one she'd first seen at the kitchen table over a child's letter practice, the one that appeared when he stopped being careful. "All right," she said. He let out a slow breath. "All right," he repeated. They sat a while longer on the step. The night came fully in. From the bunkhouse, more laughter, and then Sparky's voice saying something that made Lily shriek with delight at a volume that probably woke the horses. Hazel shook her head. "That boy," she said. "He's a good kid," Colton said. "He's 17 and feral. He'd walk through fire for your daughter." "I know," she said, more softly. I know he would. Yavinket. Summer arrived without much argument, unlike spring. The ranch moved into its full-speed operation. Longer days, harder work, the cattle moving to the high pastures, men coming and going on rotations that required a kitchen that could handle variable numbers with variable notice. Hazel managed it the way she managed most things, by knowing the variables before they arrived and building the margin in ahead of time. She'd hired help. This had taken some negotiation with herself before it took any negotiation with Colton. She had the instinct, bred from years of necessity, to do everything herself, to keep the circle of dependence small because small circles were easier to control. But the ranch had grown, and the summer numbers were real. And she was not the woman she'd been in October in terms of daily capacity, which meant she had to be smarter about what she took on. The help was a woman named Clara Voss, 22, who had come out from Carroll Wells looking for work and had what Hazel recognized as raw aptitude. She wasn't trained, but she was fast and attentive, and she didn't argue when she was shown a better way to do something. Within 3 weeks, she could handle the midday meal alone on the days Hazel needed to step back, and she did it without drama. Hazel taught her the way she herself had been taught, by a woman in a Kansas harvest camp who'd had no patience for mistakes, but infinite patience for genuine effort. Show once, correct once, trust after that. It was not always comfortable. Clara burned things and oversalted things, and once made a bread so dense it could have been used as a weapon. And Hazel told her what went wrong and why, and what to do differently, and Clara did differently, and the next loaf was better. You're good at teaching, Clara told her one afternoon. I'm good at not making it worse than it needs to be, Hazel said. Same thing, maybe. Hazel considered this. Maybe, she said. Reuben had become, gradually and without ceremony, something close to a collaborator. The trail boss work suited him in ways the combined role hadn't. He was organized, reliable, and possessed of the kind of institutional memory about the cattle operation that Walsh called invaluable, and that showed itself in small preventive decisions that stopped problems before they started. He was better at that job than he'd been at managing both, which was the thing Walsh had been trying to say for years, and that it had taken 2 frostbitten fingers to make possible. He still came to the kitchen. He came for coffee and stayed for the particular quiet of it on slow mornings, and sometimes he and Hazel talked about food the way 2 people talk about a subject they've both spent their lives thinking about, not performing knowledge, just following the thread wherever it went. He'd tried the salt in the cornbread and hadn't said anything about it directly, but she'd noticed he made it more often than he used to. On a Tuesday in early summer, he came in and sat down and said, without preamble, "There's a family in Carroll Wells, widow with 3 kids. She's a decent cook, needs work." Hazel looked at him. "Clara's good," he said, "but summer numbers are going to be up. You could use a second pair of hands you don't have to train from scratch." She thought about a widow in Carroll Wells. 3 kids. Probably the same arithmetic she'd been running in her own head a year ago, sitting in a house in Kansas with 2 bags and no destination. How old are the children? Oldest is 12, I think. Could help in the garden. She'd broken ground on the garden in April. It was modest, a test, really, to see what the soil would do. And it was doing better than she'd expected. She'd found that the work of it, the actual physical contact with dirt and seed and water, was one of the things her body responded to with something that felt like ease. She couldn't explain the physiology of it. She just knew that an hour in the garden set her up better for the afternoon than an hour of almost anything else. "Send her to see me," she said. Reuben nodded and stood at the door. "You're building something here." She looked up. "I mean the kitchen, the operation." He searched for the words, which didn't come naturally to him. "It's different than it was. People talk about it in Carroll Wells. The Mallory outfits had 3 cooks leave since February. Their men know about Iron Mesa." He paused. "That's you." "That's everyone here," she said. He shook his head once. "It started with you." He went out. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went to check on the bread. Amos Tidd came back through in July. He appeared one afternoon on his horse, moving with the same deliberate patience, and came to the kitchen door and knocked. She opened it, and he stood on the step looking approximately the same as he had in November, which was to say ancient and indestructible in equal measure. Passing through, he said. Come in, she said. He came in and sat, and she put coffee in front of him. And Lily, who was at the table doing her summer reading, the school in Cairo Wells had sent her home with books, which Lily approached with a ferocity that had surprised her teacher and no one at Iron Mesa, looked up and said, Amos! With the warmth of someone greeting a person they've been expecting. Little Mercer, he said, which was what he'd taken to calling her, and which Lily found deeply satisfying for reasons Hazel had stopped trying to understand. I got S, Lily told him. I mastered it. I never doubted it, he said. He drank his coffee and talked with Lily about the book she was reading and about where he'd been since winter. A long circuit through the southern part of the territory, work that moved the way his kind of work always moved, which was along the paths that needed someone with experience and nobody young enough to insist they knew better. He was comfortable in his own company and had been for 50 years, and it showed in the way he inhabited a room, fully present, no wasted attention. Before he left, he took Hazel aside, which meant he stood near the door while Lily was absorbed in her book. How are you? He said. And he meant the real version of the question. Better, she said, and she meant the real version of the answer. He looked at her face. He had the eyes of a man who had seen a lot of people tell him they were fine when they weren't, and he used them now with the precision of long practice. Yes, he said, as if confirming something. You are. She walked him to his horse. The boy treating you right? He said, meaning Colton. The boy is nearly 40, she said. That's not what I asked. She looked at the yard, at the kitchen garden with its summer growth, at the bunkhouse where she could hear two of the ranch hands arguing amiably about something, at the barn where Sparky was visible through the open doors doing some repair work and singing to himself off-key. Yes, she said. He's treating me right. Amos mounted with the careful economy of a man who has done it 10,000 times and knows exactly how much effort each step requires. He settled into the saddle and looked down at her. Good, he said. That's good. He turned the horse. Little Mercer will be something when she grows up. She's already something, Hazel said. He smiled, that walnut-transformed smile. Like her mother, he said, and rode out before she could respond. There was a moment in late summer that Hazel returned to for years afterward, not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was an ordinary Tuesday. The summer heat had settled into the valley, and the kitchen was warm even with both windows open, and she'd been on her feet since 5, and it was now past 2 in the afternoon, and her legs were the kind of tired that was real but manageable, which was the best category available to her, and she'd made her peace with it. She was standing out of the kitchen window, not doing anything specific. She'd come to the window to check the weather, and had stayed there a moment longer than necessary. The yard was quiet in the way of working afternoons, that particular quality of absence that means everyone is somewhere else being useful. The cottonwood had gone full summer green and was moving slightly in a warm wind that came off the mesa to the south. Lily was in the garden. She'd taken it on, the garden, with the same focused ferocity she brought to everything she decided to care about. She was 8 years old. Her birthday had been in May, a fact that the entire ranch had commemorated in various degrees of effort, with Sparky's contribution being a lopsided cake that listed heavily to starboard but tasted fine, and she knew the names of everything she'd planted and the watering schedule and which rows were struggling and why. She was in there now, crouched between the bean rows, doing something with focused attention. Colton came into the yard from the direction of the barn, dust on his jacket from the morning's work, and stopped when he saw Lily in the garden. She looked up and said something, and he said something back and crouched down beside her to look at whatever she was looking at. And they stayed like that for a moment. 2 people examining something in the dirt, one of them small and one of them not, both of them entirely absorbed. Hazel watched from the window. This was the thing she hadn't known how to name, the thing she'd kept at careful distance while she was deciding whether to trust it. This ordinary, unremarkable moment of 2 people she loved being in the same yard on a Tuesday afternoon, and nobody sick and nobody running, and the summer heat coming through the window with the smell of the garden underneath it. She had spent a year running towards something she thought of as survival, which was the floor, the minimum, the just enough. She'd been good at that. She'd kept herself and her daughter fed and housed and moving forward through conditions that had no interest in cooperating, and she'd done it without falling apart, and she was not unproud of that. But this was not survival. This was something built above the floor, something constructed deliberately from the materials available. Imperfect people, imperfect circumstances, a kitchen that ran hot on the left side until Reuben fixed it. And it was, she recognized now, the thing she had actually been moving toward all along without knowing it had a name. She turned from the window and went back to work. Walsh asked her once. It was autumn by then, the cottonwood gone gold, the summer heat relenting into something bearable. What she made of it all. He came to the kitchen in the evening and sat and held his coffee the way he always did. And after a while he said, "A year ago, you got off a wagon barely able to stand. Now you run this place." "I don't run it," she said. "You're the center of gravity," he said. He said it the way Colton had once said it, but with the specificity of a man who had been watching the evidence accumulate for months and had formed a considered conclusion. She thought about how to answer that. "I just kept moving," she said. "People try to make that sound simple," Walsh said. "It isn't." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He drank his coffee. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood and the light was the particular amber of October afternoons, low and rich and temporary. "My mother used to say," he started, and then stopped, which was unusual for Walsh, who didn't generally start sentences he wasn't prepared to finish. He tried again. "She said the hardest thing in the world isn't doing the brave thing once. It's getting up the next day and doing the ordinary thing. Because the ordinary thing doesn't feel like enough, and nobody sees it, and it still costs you." Hazel stood at the counter and looked at the man who had been the first to doubt her and one of the first to change. Walsh, who'd picked up a dish towel at 2 a.m. and cut biscuit dough he didn't know how to cut. Walsh, who'd told Colton to make her an offer before some other outfit did. "Your mother was right," she said. He nodded, finished his coffee, set the cup on the table. "Good supper tonight," he said, which was what he said when he meant something more than that, and she'd learned to hear both. The last frost of that autumn came early, in October, and caught the tail end of the garden. Hazel was out the next morning assessing the damage, some of the late beans gone, the squash finished, and Lily came out behind her in her coat and boots, and stood at the garden edge looking at the frost-darkened leaves with an expression of genuine grief that only a child who has watched something grow from seed can manage. "Is it dead?" Lily said. "Some of it." "The beans?" "Yes." Lily crouched at the edge of the bed, touched one of the leaves, which had gone dark and soft. "We can plant more next year," she said. "We can. And the year after." "Yes." Lily stood up and looked at the garden with the clear-eyed practicality that had always been the core of her underneath the big feelings. "Okay," she said. "We'll do it again." Hazel looked at her daughter. 8 years old and already arrived at the lesson that most people spent their whole lives working toward, that you didn't get to keep everything, and the answer to that was not to stop growing things. "We will," she said. They walked back to the house together in the frost-sharp morning, and the kitchen was warm when they came through the door, and there was coffee on and bread in the oven, and the men were beginning to stir in the bunkhouse, and another day was starting at Iron Mesa in the way that days had started there since January, because a woman had gotten off a wagon barely able to stand and had asked for one chance and had not stopped asking for it, quietly, in the way of someone who knows that the asking is the work, and the work doesn't stop. Not because she was fearless, not because her body cooperated, not because the circumstances were favorable, because they had been, most of the time, exactly not that, but because stopping had never been, for her, a real option. And because somewhere along the way, without her entirely intending it, the place she had no choice but to keep going had become the place she most wanted to be. The bread was ready. She could smell it. She went to check on it, the way she always did, the way she always would, not waiting to be certain, just going toward the thing that needed doing, with her hands and whatever strength she had that day, which was enough. It was always, somehow, enough.